Welcome, everybody, and this is our Advent series on Revelation, which I am calling Badvent, but nobody's laughing at my joke apart from me, but I enjoyed it anyway. It's a little bit different. I'm not going to be talking at you. Instead, we've recorded a conversation with our good friend Stephen Backhouse, and we're going to, just share that with you and talk about three different themes over 3 weeks. So today we're going to talk about Jesus. Next week, we're going to talk about the church. And then the third week, we're going to talk about the big E, like time and history, and what Revelation tells us about the future, maybe, or maybe not. But before we get into all of that, let's welcome and say hi to Stephen. How are you doing, Stephen?
I'm really good. This is a fun idea. I like Badvent. You and I will laugh at that, even if nobody else.
Yeah, I'm pleased. I'm pleased somebody is kind of on the same channel.
I also just absolutely love doing the book of Revelation for Advent because nobody does that, and it's brilliant. And even the book of Revelation has its own nativity scene, so it's a Christmas book. Nobody thinks of that, but it's a Christmas book, so it's great.
Yes. Yeah. Wonderful. Because and that didn't occur to me either. But of course, there is a nativity scene, we're doing this partly because Advent is a time of looking forward and preparing, and some people call it Little Lent, don't they?
Yeah.
It's a kind of time of preparation. We collapse Christmas into it. We get going with the Christmas festivities early, including at Trinity Vineyard. Do you have any particular Advent practices that you keep? Any way that you?
Okay, so I'm a political theologian, which is why I'm chatting with you. And I spend a lot of my time in lots of different churches. I'm like a freelance theologian, and different churches or groups will bring me in to talk with people or to help consult. I'm almost like a consultant, and I help groups arrange themselves or charities or companies figure out how to like organize themselves in Christianly and use their power well. So I'm always jumping around to lots of different groups, and I'm Canadian, and I have American partners and UK partners and Irish partners. So Advent to me is like, I just noticed different groups celebrate it in different ways. And there are some groups I work with wouldn't even know what Advent was at all. And some of them might think it was like some sort of weird culty thing. And then I have other groups. Like I was just talking to a group last night, like Advent is really important to them. Like, and I was the one now like making mistakes. And I was going, am I allowed to talk about Christmas? Because they get offended if you talk about Christmas, because it's not Christmas, it's Advent.
Not Christmas yet.
So for me, Advent is like a minefield, and I never really know. I don't treat it, I treat it with respect, but it's not a huge part of my spiritual landscape. So I like it. I like the fact it exists, but I didn't grow up with it. And so I'm figuring it out myself, what it is that Advent really means.
And Revelation, therefore, is a good thing to be looking at. And I've sometimes tried to teach a little bit on Revelation, but truth be told, really complicated and difficult.
Nightmare. I mean, it's the book that, like, there are some types of Christians for whom they've never read the book of Revelation. Like, it has nothing to do with them. And then there are other Christians for whom it's basically the only book they read. Like, it's so extreme. What's your experience with the book of Revelation? How does that figure in your life?
I would definitely like try and roll it out around this time of year, and kind of, but also we taught a series on the church and talked a little bit about some of the letters to the 7 churches, and which is probably the most accessible part of the book, and the book which most people kind of, if they're going to teach a bit of Revelation, they might teach a bit on that.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
It kind of ignore the crazy rest of it. Or conversely, if you're really interested in the crazy, you want to go for the like vivid imagery in the middle parts and the later parts.
They get out their wall charts and their lines. They draw connections between.
Which is interesting, isn't it? And I've been working and talking with a few kind of fellow travelers, studying through it, trying to get to grips with it, and it's a bit of a foreboding task. But it did strike me that the book kind of gives it gives the game away in the first verse, doesn't it? Or it kind of says, this is the revelation. We need to talk about Revelation a bit in a minute, but this is the revelation of Jesus Christ. So, and this, whatever else it is, it's a book about Jesus.
Yeah.
And when it feels like when you switch into a mode like that, and that's what we're going to talk about today, that makes it a little bit more. Okay, so what am I not talking about here? Because we come with an agenda. You know, where are we in this kind of historical narrative? Is this about the sweep of history, and are we drawing to its conclusion or not? And all those kind of questions we have, but we forget to listen for what it's saying about Jesus. But we'll chat about that in a minute. I'm just really interested in this. What your take on apocalypse, and of course that has a particular meaning. But what the kind of genre of this book is, so that we can begin to address it well. I mean, I think there are kind of particular techniques or particular ways of approaching this as just a kind of general starter for 10. This is how we should read this book.
Well, so I think we often hear the word apocalypse. So the book of Revelation is also called the Apocalypse of St. John. And there's a connection here, because apocalypse doesn't mean the end of the world, which is what we've trained to think, right? We're trained to think that apocalypse means everything coming to an end with fire, and the moon comes crashing to earth, and the blood seas turn to blood. But the apocalypse in the Jewish first century world doesn't mean the end of the world. It means the end of an age and the beginning of a new one. So the end of one age always brings about the beginning of a new era. And you'll notice that there's quite a lot of apocalyptic language in the New Testament, and it's always connected to childbirth. So Jesus will say things like, this is like a woman giving birth. Paul will say, all creation waits in eager expectation with groans.
Yeah, labor pains.
Right, the idea is that, like a woman who's giving birth, it's the end of one era of her life. And in pain, it brings forth a new era of life. And this is the mental space, the emotional place that early Christians find themselves in. And they thought that Jesus and his actions on earth, or the kingdom he was making, heralded the end of the kingdoms of man and the beginning of the kingdom of God. And so they felt they were living in that place. And so they lived apocalyptically, not because they thought the whole world was going to be burnt up in some sort of end of the world Hollywood blockbuster, but they said, we are living in the end times. We are living in the times when the normal ways of life have come to an end, and new ways of life are emerging. And that's how the book of Revelation centers itself to groups of followers of Jesus who are living under, at the time, they're living under oppression under the Roman Empire. And the book of Revelation is like, God. So the revelation comes in because there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So the end of this world, you're going to see wars and rumors of wars, and you're going to see people fighting and killing each other. You're going to see merchants and kings trading and buying and selling and expanding their empires using violence. But don't be alarmed. That's going to come to an end, and you're going to see God's truth breaking through. There's revelation in the end of the way of life of the normal world, right?
So that's so much there. I can see this is going to be a difficult conversation because it's really tempting to hair off in several different directions at once. But it was like that idea of an end of an age and the beginning of a new one. Yeah. But in a sense, would you say it's fair to say that like Revelation reveals the way that history is always ending? There is always a kind of conclusion of an age. There is always a sense of disruption. Like a lot of people have talked about 2020 as being kind of apocalyptic in the technical sense of revealing a lot of what's going on, and there's a time of shifting as well, like whatever 2021 looks like, you know, all these kind of cliches like get back or build back better or build back differently or get back to normal, or the sense of that like we do live at the end of an age and something different is waiting for us in the future.
You always do. Every generation is apocalypse. Like every generation has an apocalypse, because there's always a new one coming up through the ranks. So there's lots of apocalypses. Like every form of life that you live within your lifetime will be renewed, because a new person or a new group will be coming through the system. And in some ways, the Revelation or the apocalyptic literature, it's not just the book of Revelation. So Mark 13, chapter 13 has a lot of this. The book of Romans has this. And the idea is like, don't worry. When you see this happen, don't lose your tiny minds, because things like this happen all the time. And that it's not the end of the world when you see the end of your little form of life. That's not the end of the world. That's just the beginning of a new one. And so it's in fact, ironically, this kind of material is often used to scare the crap out of people, when in fact it's meant to be, or it was used pastorally for the early Christians, which is, I know it feels like the end of the world, but take heart. We've seen this before. It's not the end of the story. And that's why the book of Revelation is actually not ultimately about the destruction of this earth. It's about the creation of a new heaven and a new earth. It's about the kingship of Jesus, who's always opposed to the kingship of humans. And so it's constantly a book of hope, actually. But of reminding yourself, don't get complacent. Don't. Two groups of people get addressed in the book of Revelation. One is the people who are complacent and think that they've become too comfortable with the ways of this world. And that in one of those letters to the 7 churches, right, that's one of the lukewarm people. But there's another group of people who are huddled in persecution, and they're thinking that this is the end, and they're losing heart. So the book of Revelation addresses both, saying, don't get too comfortable with this world because it's going to end. And then there's another group saying, don't get too comfortable with persecution because that's going to end as well. Yeah.
Fascinating. And like encouragement is sort of what we need. And at the same time, everybody this year has sort of lost we've all lost something. I don't know whether we've lost our minds or not, but we've lost a lot of confidence. We've lost a lot of our plans. You know, a lot of that's been thrown up against the wall, and it just feels appropriate to read this and kind of receive encouragement and say,
I agree.
This has all happened before.
Yeah. The other thing, I mean, the word Satan shows up a lot in book of Revelation. But one of the things you have to notice about Satan is that he's always falling. Every time you meet Satan in the Bible, eventually he gets struck down. And that's one of the features of Satan. That there's a constant falling of Satan. So the snake in the
He's such a loser. Stop saying, guy. He's such a loser.
Yeah, the snake in the garden cast down onto the earth. The figure in the book of Daniel who sets himself up high above the heavens, cast down to the earth. Jesus sends the disciples out, and they heal the sick and cast out demons, and they come back and tell Jesus what they've done. And he says, "I saw Satan fall like lightning."
Yeah. It's really interesting that I've been really that came to mind a lot reading through Revelation. This idea of Satan being cast down, and just remembering that Jesus said that to his disciples, but it wasn't like a dramatic historical event. It was in their work for the kingdom. It was in their declaration of the gospel. It was in their healing people. I saw Satan fall like.
Yeah, it's constant. And you have to remember that Satan isn't like this little red demon sitting on your shoulder whispering to you to lust or to be greedy. Satan is the figure who has been given the rule of this world, right? He's the prince of this age. And so Satan is the one that tempts Jesus and says, if you bow to me, all these nations will be yours. And the gift is his to give. So for whatever reason, Satan is associated with politics and the rule of nations and kings and war and merchants and all that. And the rule of Jesus is seen as opposed to that, right? So that's what's happening here. That the rule of this age is being cast down. It's always coming to an end. And the reign of God is always breaking through if you have ears to see and ears to hear and eyes to see. Yeah.
Which brings us on to the way that sometimes that conflict is played out. And I thought we could, one of the things we ought to talk about in this session is like how Jesus is appearing in different ways at different parts of Revelation. So and I was really encouraged this morning. I was reading a commentary and it said, oh no, it's really important that Jesus appears in 3 distinct different ways. I was like, yes, no, I was making sense. But there is,
what else? How else does he appear?
well, there's in the beginning, John has a vision of someone like the Son of Man. He doesn't actually name as Jesus, but I suppose that we strongly take that implication, the Son of Man being a title that Jesus used for himself. And that's a very vivid imagery, white hair, kind of rainbow image, kind of brass legs and all sorts of kind of apocalyptic, in the technical sense, like from Daniel, it feels like. But and then there is in the middle section of the book, there is this figure of a lamb, or a kind of combination. What John hears is of a lion turns around and sees a slain lamb. And then towards the end of the book, there's an image of a rider on a white horse. And that seems to carry some of like it's much more militaristic in it. And there's this kind of sword coming out of his mouth. There is and like the book of Revelation does like feel quite like a violent book, and there is lots of relatively violent imagery. But I'm just really interested in those 3 different ways, because it feels like if this is a revelation of Jesus Christ as well as a revelation from Jesus Christ, those things are telling us something about Jesus. What's your take on the way that we see Jesus in Revelation?
Yeah, this is good. So first of all, the Son of Man, that is an allusion to Daniel. Jesus himself uses this language for himself, right? And in the book of Daniel, there's this vision that one like the Son of Man comes, and he's given the authority to sit at the right hand of the throne room of God. And you have to think that in the Jewish imagination has this idea that sons of God were angels. Okay, so they were these angelic beings. Remember how I talked about how Satan was given the rule of the nation? Well, Satan is also described as one of the sons of God in the Old Testament. And so sons of God are these semi-divine or angelic beings that are given the rule of different nations or tribes. And part of their story is that they're doing a bad job. So God will call them to his throne room. In the Psalms, it was God sits on his throne room and he calls together the sons of God, and he says, I've got this complaint against you. You're forgetting the cause of the oppressed. You aren't dealing with widows and orphans very well. Like, he basically blames the divine rulers for doing a bad job. In the book of Daniel, you get this idea that the sons of God are in God's throne room, and they get pushed aside, and instead comes one like the Son of Man. And he appears, and the Lord says to him, come sit at my right hand and take my authority. That's why Jesus comes and he says, I'm like the Son of Man. And he uses that language, and he adopts for himself that imagery, which is to do with authority and rule. And so John, this is like a label associated with Jesus very early on, and John's apocalypse takes that. And again, it's about ruling and reigning in authority, right? So then you have the Lamb. So the other thing that Jesus is associated with is, of course, the Lamb of God, which takes away the sin of the world, the sacrifice. The one who is killed and does not kill. Okay, so the idea of how Jesus deals with his enemies is really important to who Jesus is. So the early Christians were like, Jesus defeated sin and death by submitting to everything that humans could throw at him. All of the organized violence of religion and popular mob and empire and Roman Empire, all of that organized violence we threw at Jesus, and he submitted to it and was killed by it and then rose again.
Yeah.
So the resurrected lamb is like the symbol in the early church for this is how we deal with our enemies.
And in the vision there that John's having of like is and there's again there's lots of like rabbit trails I want to run down and but it seems some of those components are there that you were talking about. So the throne is surrounded by 24 elders. And but what I was really interested to ask you was the way in which there is an expectation, or is this about expectation? Is this about, so John hears about the moment is where there's this sealed scroll on the throne beside God, but no one can be found that can open it. But then someone tells John about the Lion of Judah, but what he turns around and sees is not a lion at all.
Exactly.
So what's all that about?
See, the lamb doesn't turn into a lion. He's always a lamb, right? So again, it's part of this idea of like, what people were waiting for, this righteous Braveheart type nationalist folk hero figure who was going to destroy his enemies and ethnically cleanse the land and free everyone. And Jesus comes along and he loves his enemies and he heals Roman servants and children and he submits to evil. And the early Christians are now faced with, oh crap, now what do? He's our king, he's a Messiah, but he doesn't look like anything we thought he's supposed to look like. So they start to think, well, maybe the way Jesus acted really is how you're supposed to deal with this stuff. Maybe you don't defeat evil by being even more evil.
But it's a hard message to hear that, Stephen, wouldn't you say? Because like...
Oh, we haven't got to the third image of Jesus yet.
But one of the things they would have been thinking about is like, okay, so Jesus isn't going to protect me like it's interesting when talking about Revelation. A lot of people would reach for like C.S. Lewis and his kind of stuff around the last battle and those kind of images, and of course the central images in C.S. Lewis writing is of a lion, Aslan, who is complicated and like gentle but also dangerous in lots of ways. And but one of the things that the early Christians must have been longing for was someone who would like protect them and intervene powerfully and almost violently against the violence that they were experiencing. Wow. You know, anybody that ever experiences violence wants somebody to, or wants themselves to respond with violence, or somebody to protect them, like physically, just keep me safe.
So, I mean, have a look at Revelation 19, which is where the white horse Jesus appears. At the end of Revelation 19, you're getting sort of from verse 11 onwards, right? Which is the white horse who appears, and that's Jesus again, and he's this military figure. So we've met the Son of Man, who's the authority figure. We've met the Lamb, who's the sacrifice, and that's how he deals with evil. And now we meet this military figure, and he's leading an army, and his robes are dipped in blood. Whose blood is his robes dipped in?
His own blood.
His own.
Because nothing's been, no swords have been drawn yet.
It's his own blood that he's drenched with. It's not his enemies. He's got a sword. What is his sword?
The word is the sword. Is the word. Yeah.
Who are his soldiers described as? He's leading an army. Who are they? What's the word the Revelation uses for them?
I can't remember that. I remember they're robed in white. But say again.
Martyr. So here comes a military figure, drenched in his own blood. He's the Lamb who was slain. He's leading an army of martyrs, and he's defeating his enemies with his words. So it's military figure, it's military symbolism, but it totally undermines what you might expect from a military figure, right? So the personality of Jesus doesn't actually change. They're using military ideas, but they're not endorsing. Jesus doesn't all of a sudden stop being the Lamb who was slain. He doesn't stop being this cosmic figure who's going to put the whole world back to rights. They're like, this is how the world gets put back to rights. This is how we do it. And then there's a lot of talk about the wrath of God, and he's gonna like a wine press, right at the end of Revelation. a lot of the wrath of God language in the New Testament, it's not like God sitting on a throne like an Olympic judge. At the end of everything, he then holds up his card saying 5 out of 10 or 2 out of 10. The wrath of God often operates in the New Testament more like that if you persist in your rebellion, you will get what you want. And it will be experienced as if it's the wrath of God. So Babylon comes to it gets destroyed, and the smoke will constantly be rising. The destruction of Babylon, which is the city of man, right? With these empires, organized empires, setting themselves up in rebellion of God. It destroys itself. It gets what it wants. And a lot of this is like the bad end that the people come to in the book of Revelation. They're coming to the bad end that they chose for themselves. It's kind of like, if you persist in this, I'm going to give you what you want. And it's going to be experienced like the wrath of God.
It's interesting there at the end that although it kind of sets itself up as for a great conflagration, you know, everybody's heading to the battlefield for a battle.
Yeah,
there really isn't a battle at the end. There is no end time battle. There's just another judgment and a final judgment of Satan and those that follow him. It's interesting that this warrior rides forth, but almost as a sense of he doesn't even need to fight the battle.
Yeah, and I think people like C.S. Lewis and others, I mean, that a lot of Christians, we got to notice how our imaginations, including C.S. Lewis, have been actually gripped by violence. I mean, we're colonized by patriotism and violence, and we have all this imagery of the righteous war and just war and all this. And we're kind of drunk on this idea that killing our enemies is going to solve our problems. And the book of Revelation doesn't really allow you to do that. If you're reading it from within the world of that is close to Jesus in his way, and you realize that they're always subverting military language. So even Paul is using the armor of God language. He's taking all the parts of a Roman military kit and he's subverting it. So he says, take the sword of the Spirit or take the boots of peace. And like, he's just subverting all the things that Rome would use. He's giving it a different meaning. And that happens a lot. And it even happens in the book of Revelation. But in 2,000 years' time, we've become distant from that. And we read these military metaphors as if they are actual military solutions. When actually they are not. They are against military solutions. The military solutions of killing your enemies and fighting each other to expand your territory and all that, that's one of the works of Satan that gets destroyed by the end of the book of Revelation. Because all the you know, there's that story, that imagery of like all the leaders with their crowns, and they take off their crowns and they throw them at Jesus's feet.
Yeah.
That is them giving up their sovereignty and giving up their national self-interest. And Jesus in the book of Revelation 19, he shows up wearing many crowns, right? He's taken all the sovereignty on himself. And it's not this kind of affirmation of national vindication in the book of Revelation. The end of the nations is that they are dissolved or they lose their sovereignty. Because
I mean, inevitably we do read the book in a way that, because there is a sense. I was looking back on some old preaching notes, and I said, and even I'd forgotten this, which so therefore I worry for anybody that listens to my preaching, they've probably well forgotten this. But I use this analogy of like Revelation is an ultrasound, which is an image of something that's real, and is quite important to see, but it's not visible to the naked eye. So therefore, God gives his son Jesus this revelation that's then given to an angel, that's then given to John, that's then given to the churches. Like, you need to know this picture. You need to be able to see this ultrasound to understand what's really going on. And there is this cosmic conflict thing happening, and we do want to read into that, don't we? And that's something that very, very powerful kind of cultural images as well. A lot of our kind of films, a lot of our novels, a lot of our kind of popular entertainment are kind of rooted in that kind of cosmic conflict narrative. Yeah. So, I mean, how do you read that as a someone who's thought a lot about Revelation, also conscious of the ways in which it can be misread? You know, like we, the good people, Jesus on our side, i.e. the British, or the Americans, or
Yes.
yeah, who's on whose side here?
This is one of the major issues with this book of Revelation, is that we've got groups of people who are trained to read it as if it's primarily talking about them. So throughout history, whatever civilization happens to be the most recent and the top of the pile, they think book of Revelation is about them. So Americans think it's about them. The Brits thought it was about them. It always happens, right? And we've tended to forget that actually it was primarily written for the 7 churches who were in operation in the year 90.
Yeah.
And literally, it's about them. It's so funny, all these people who take the book of Revelation literally. They love all the stuff about dragons and fire and the Whore of Babylon. And then they forget the one part you are actually meant to take literally, which is this is written.
7 churches, yeah.
And a lot of what's going on in the book of Revelation is just reframing. So the sorts of things that are being experienced by the early church under Emperor Nero and being kicked out of the synagogues. So the early Christians are being kicked out of their synagogues because they thought they were Jewish, but now they're being cursed by the synagogues. They're also being despised and rejected or ignored by Rome or under persecution. So they're living in a constant oppression. And the book of Revelation is partly showing the spiritual side of the thing they're experiencing right now. It's like it's telling them their story, but from a spiritual point of view. And a very classic case in point would be the nativity story. Yeah. That the book of Revelation, so we've got a nativity story told in Matthew and Luke of Jesus being born, and there's stables and shepherds and wise men and all that. There is a similar story in the book of Revelation, but it's all like there's a mother giving birth and the dragon was crouched ready to snatch her baby away. And it's telling the same story, but from a cosmic point of view, right? And it's like it's trying to say, imagine what we're going through now, but from a heavenly perspective. And it isn't really about like predicting the future. It's more about saying, look, we are part of something right now that's bigger than just what you can see. And we are part of a story that links further back than just you right now. And it also links ahead more. There is a future going on. Like, we're part of something bigger than just us.
Yeah.
And I think that's how I do want to primarily read the book of Revelation as if it was written by and for Christians living under Roman persecution, because that is just literally what it is.
Yeah, and says about itself as well. This revelation to those churches.
You're almost doing it a dishonor. You're not treating people as you would want to be treated. You're actually breaking the golden rule when you read the book of Revelation as if it is primarily written about you right now or the future. Because what you're doing is you're actually ignoring the brothers and sisters in Christ who wrote that book, who read that book, who needed it in their time. And you're just ignoring them completely. And you're not treating others the way you would want to be treated. And I feel like any value that comes from the book of Revelation, if you forget who it was originally for, you lose the value of it. And you start to read it. We aren't an oppressed minority. I know a lot of Christians today think they are, but to be frank, there's no group in all of history who is as well-resourced and privileged as Christians are today. And I'm not saying there's no persecution anywhere, but I'm saying certainly if you're a Western Christian, if you live in the UK or America, you are statistically more privileged than any other religious group has ever been in all of history. And when you read the book of Revelation, primarily as some sort of, you are reading it, you already are distorted. But if you read it as a first century Christian who was actually ignored, there was no emperors trying to use Christian language to get votes. There was no television and media empires aimed at you. There's no Christian publishing houses. There's nothing set up to support you and your aims. When you read the book of Revelation from below rather than from above, it becomes a source of encouragement rather than some sort of weird revenge fantasy against your atheist liberal enemies or whatever.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was reading, so D.H. Lawrence wrote a little bit about Revelation.
Really?
He was, this was one of the things he noted about it, obviously being not particularly sympathetic towards religion or Christianity or whatever. But he said, this is kind of a revenge fantasy, but it's for the very weak and marginalized.
Exactly.
You can see how Christianity gets its reputation, he's saying, as a kind of slave religion, something that's for people who experience weakness and marginality in life, and then they have this vision of when they're going to be, kind of calling the shots, or where Jesus.
Yeah, it has not fed the best instincts in Christian culture. That's true. Yeah. The Book of Revelation has had a very pernicious influence on Christian imagination.
Yeah.
But it's canon. It's part of what we have, and I think there's real value in it. But we just have to be careful that we don't let it feed the worst parts of ourselves, rather than transform us.
So let's finish then this week, because we've already talked about it so much. But by returning to that idea, I mean, I suppose theologians or people like me might talk about a pastoral function. That kind of sense of always wanting to get things right from a historical perspective and theologically ground it well, but also understand what kind of promises, what kind of encouragement, what kind of vision should we be adopting from Revelation. I suppose I'm interested, for people who might be watching this, but also for a Christian in another place. People. I mean, some people say that the 21st century is the most persecutory age. Of course, you're right to say that in the West, none of that has really landed at our door, but across the world there is a lot of persecution of Christians. So what would be some thoughts around that kind of pastoral reading of this book?
Well, one of the things for all that the Book of Revelation has lots of people coming to bloody, smoky, bad ends, it also contains the highest forms of worship any Christian has ever done. Like, I challenge you to find any better worship lyrics than what you see in the Book of Revelation. Like, Handel's Messiah just quotes the Book of Revelation.
Yes.
For example. And from a pastoral point of view, it's really useful. Simply open up your Book of Revelation and just read the poems. Just let your eyes skip over and just read them as if it's one long poem. And it's the worship aspect is really high, and it's really good. And it's worship in the face of the world. The world either hates you or it doesn't understand you. So I don't think that I live in a persecuted environment, but I do live in an environment which is indifferent to me, for sure. So, but like the worship aspect of Revelation, I think, is really important. And if you are turned off by all the crazies and their conspiracy theories and don't read the Book of Revelation at all, then you're missing out on the best worship passages that any human has ever written about Jesus. So there's my pastoral suggestion. Read the worship passages.
Worthy is the Lamb.
It's amazing stuff.
Yeah.
Worthy is the Lamb. And hallelujah, how great is it's just this idea of this throngs of heaven, the elevation of Jesus, who, by the way, remember, Jesus was within living memory. Like, the Book of Revelation is a late book in the Gospels, but it is conceivably within living memory of Jesus that it was written down, right? And Jesus is not, I know, like, we like to think of the development of religion, and sometimes our atheist friends or whatever might say, Jesus was just a normal teacher, but generations of people added all the extra cosmic, miraculous stuff onto him, and they made him into a figure he never really was, which makes sense, right? Problem is, it goes against the actual documentary evidence we have, which is that these texts were written within living memory of him, and they're portraying him as King of Kings, Lord of Lords, holy, 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 at your feet every knee will bow. You might not believe that Jesus, it doesn't prove that Jesus was God, but the people who knew Jesus thought he was God.
And there is this prospect, I mean, by tradition, this is written by the Apostle John, although that's debatable. So someone who actually knew Jesus. And I suppose in that first vision of Jesus that John has in the first chapter, what you have is someone with a shining face. It's really resonant of the transfiguration story.
Yes.
And there's like this sense of this Son of Man does span these kind of dual realities.
He's the one, the shining face is the one like the Son of Man, who, by the way, is the same figure that Paul meets on the road to Damascus. One shining like a star. And that is an imagery that is what Jesus seems to have been for people. They met the risen Jesus and he was one shining like a star. So
that is a great note on which to finish. And my appetite is really whetted for next week. We'll talk more about this stuff and then the week after. So thank you very much.
Oh, this is fun. Bless you guys.
Yeah.
Bless you, Paul, and Vineyard and everyone there.
Thank you. All right. Stop recording.